In the early 1970s, Santa Cruz, California, was not a place people associated with danger. It was a coastal college town defined by routine and rhythm students walking between classes, cars idling near campus entrances, conversations stretching late into the night. Hitchhiking was common. Trust was casual. Most people believed that risk lived elsewhere, in larger cities or darker neighborhoods. Not here. The atmosphere mattered. This was a community where strangers often felt familiar, where offering someone a ride did not immediately raise concern. The landscape itself encouraged a sense of openness, long roads, wooded edges, the ocean never far away. Violence, when it occurred, was assumed to be rare and personal, not patterned or predatory. That assumption shaped how people moved through their days and how institutions understood threat. At the same time, the investigative environment of the era was limited in ways that are difficult to fully appreciate from a modern perspective. Law enforcement agencies operated within fragmented jurisdictions. Information sharing was slow and informal. There were no centralized databases, no standardized behavioral profiling units, and no shared language for identifying emerging patterns of serial violence. Psychological crime analysis existed, but mostly at the margins, still forming its vocabulary and methods. Police work relied heavily on visible evidence and immediate suspects. Crimes were understood as isolated events unless proven otherwise. Subtle behavioral warning signs, especially those that unfolded over years, were rarely tracked in a systematic way. In this environment, it was possible for concerning behaviors to register as individual anomalies rather than parts of a larger trajectory. It is within this context that we encounter Ed Kemper, not yet as a figure of notoriety, but as a presence that blended into the background of the town. In his early 20s, Kemper was physically imposing, unusually tall, and noticeably intelligent. He spoke calmly, appeared reflective, and was capable of engaging conversation. He was known to local law enforcement not as a suspect, but socially. He listened, asked questions, and seemed interested in police work. At a surface level, there was nothing that demanded alarm. He lived locally. He drove familiar roads. He occupied the same everyday spaces as students, workers, and officers. Any oddities in his behavior could be interpreted as quirks rather than signals. In a town accustomed to eccentricity, difference did not necessarily translate into danger. This is precisely why the case continues to be studied, not because it remained unsolved, and not because of the scale of violence alone, but because warning signs appeared early and were encountered repeatedly. The systems designed to evaluate risk crossed paths with him more than once, yet failed to interrupt the progression. What followed was not chaotic or random. It unfolded along a discernible psychological path. This case suggests that extreme violence does not always announce itself loudly. Sometimes it develops quietly, inside ordinary environments, sustained by routine, trust, and institutional blind spots. The danger is not only in intent, but in how easily intent can remain unchallenged when it fits comfortably within the rhythms of everyday life. When reconstructing this case, the first challenge is separating what can be verified from what is known only through later recollection. The record is uneven. Some events are documented in detail. Others exist primarily because the subject described them after the fact. That imbalance matters because it shapes how we interpret intent, escalation, and control. The early sus confirmed facts begin in childhood. Ed Kemper was born in 1948. His parents divorced when he was young, an event that led to a fragmented upbringing and long periods of emotional instability within the household. Court records and family accounts confirm prolonged isolation during his formative years. He was often separated from siblings and confined to specific spaces within the home. These conditions are documented, not inferred. There are also reports of early violent behavior toward animals. These accounts appear consistently across interviews and secondary sources, but they are not supported by contemporaneous police reports. The record is largely silent on dates, frequency, or intervention. We know these behaviors were later described. We do not know how visible they were at the time, or how seriously they were taken by adults in his environment. The first homicides, however, are firmly documented. In August 1964, at the age of 15, Kemper killed his paternal grandparents at their home. The method, location, and sequence of events are well established. After the killings, he contacted authorities himself and waited for police to arrive. This immediate confession is not in dispute. What is less certain are the motivations he later described. Kemper claimed that he killed his grandmother to experience what it felt like to kill, and that he killed his grandfather to spare him the pain of discovering his wife's death. These explanations come solely from Kemper. They were not corroborated by independent evidence, and they were offered after the fact, in a context where he was already engaging with psychiatric evaluators. The emotional framing is therefore informative, but not verifiable. Following these killings, the institutional response shifted the trajectory of the case. Kemper underwent psychiatric evaluation and was diagnosed with a severe mental disorder. Over time, that diagnosis changed. His behavior during institutionalization was described as compliant, articulate, and cooperative. On paper, improvement was observed. Eventually, he was deemed rehabilitated and released. The rationale was grounded in observed behavior and available psychiatric frameworks of the era, not in long-term risk modeling, which did not yet exist. After his release, the timeline resumes with clearer documentation. Kemper returned to live with his mother in Santa Cruz. He applied multiple times to join law enforcement and was rejected, reportedly due to physical criteria rather than psychological concerns. During this period, he legally acquired firearms and purchased a vehicle that allowed him to move freely and inconspicuously within the community. What follows is a long interval that deserves attention. Kemper later stated that he regularly picked up hitchhiking women, sometimes hundreds of times, without harming them. These encounters are difficult to verify individually, but the pattern itself is consistent. There is a notable delay between opportunity and action, between access and violence. This gap is significant. It suggests observation, rehearsal, and restraint, rather than impulsive behavior. The timeline indicates a form of containment violence held in reserve until internal conditions aligned. The escalation that followed was not sudden. It was preceded by years of proximity without action, a pattern that complicates simple explanations and forces us to consider how intent can exist quietly, long before it becomes visible. Any psychological analysis risks becoming abstract unless it returns, again and again, to the people most directly affected. In this case, the victims were not symbols or statistics. They were young women with ordinary routines, predictable schedules, and expectations shaped by the social norms of their time. Many were students. Their days were structured around classes, part-time jobs, friendships, and the quiet assumption that familiar spaces were largely safe. What made them vulnerable was not recklessness, but conformity. Hitchhiking, particularly in college towns during the early 1970s, was widely accepted. It was a practical solution to limited transportation, reinforced by a cultural belief in shared trust. Accepting a ride was not understood as a high-risk decision. It was an everyday choice, repeated thousands of times by people who arrived safely at their destinations. In these encounters, Ed Kemper presented no obvious threat. He was articulate, calm, and capable of adjusting his demeanor to match the expectations of the moment. Witness accounts and later analysis suggest that he avoided overt intimidation. His conversational style was controlled and attentive. The vehicle itself became a transitional space, neither public nor fully private, where social scripts discouraged immediate resistance. In many cases, there is no evidence of a struggle at the point of entry. That absence is significant. It suggests compliance shaped by context, not consent, and trust shaped by routine rather than judgment. The methods of killing varied. Some victims were shot, others strangled. These acts occurred in isolated areas, reached after short drives away from populated spaces. The deaths were direct and decisive. What followed, however, indicates that the act of killing alone was not the endpoint. Post-mortem behavior, described here only in clinical terms, involved prolonged interaction with the bodies. This behavior points toward control and possession rather than concealment. Bodies were transported, stored temporarily, and later discarded in remote locations. These actions required planning, time, and a tolerance for risk. It is important to note that these acts often took place while Kemper's mother was away from the home. That detail appears repeatedly in the record and may indicate an internal boundary he maintained. The domestic space, shared with her, functioned as both a practical and psychological setting for his behavior. The relationship with his mother occupies a central position in any analysis of this period. Accounts describe a pattern of ongoing verbal degradation and emotional dismissal. She reportedly ridiculed his appearance, questioned his masculinity, and undermined his sense of autonomy. Over time, this dynamic appears to have contributed to an internal conflict centered on power and humiliation. The violence directed outward toward strangers may have served as a displaced response, an attempt to reverse a long-standing imbalance without confronting its source. As the killings continued, subtle behavioral changes emerged. The time between offenses shortened. The logistical care taken after each act began to erode. There are indications of increased agitation, reflected in riskier decisions and reduced attention to concealment. These shifts do not suggest loss of control in the conventional sense, but rather a narrowing of focus. The violence became less exploratory and more purposeful. From a psychological perspective, these changes may indicate that the earlier acts were no longer sufficient to regulate the underlying tension. The pattern suggests movement away from generalized violence toward a specific, unresolved emotional target. The victims remained central to the harm, but the internal narrative driving the behavior appears to have tightened, concentrating on a single relationship that had shaped his identity for decades. This chapter marks a transition point. The violence had not yet ended, but its direction was becoming clearer. The behavior suggests not escalation for its own sake, but convergence toward a moment where the original conflict could no longer be avoided. By the time the violence was recognized as patterned, much of the record was already incomplete. This case is shaped not only by what was documented, but by what never was. The absences matter. They influence how risk was assessed, how warnings were interpreted, and how long the trajectory continued uninterrupted. There are encounters that were never logged. By Kemper's own account, he interacted with many young women before any killings occurred, offering rides without incident. Whether the number was dozens or hundreds is impossible to confirm. These interactions left no formal trace. They were not crimes. They were not complaints. In the record, they do not exist. The same is true for near misses, moments when a situation may have felt uncomfortable but ended without harm, without injury or clear threat. Such experiences rarely became reports, and therefore never accumulated into a recognizable pattern. Psychiatric documentation also reflects gaps. Evaluations were conducted, diagnoses assigned, and later revised. But long-term behavioral monitoring was limited. Some reports were summarized rather than preserved in full. Others reflected the clinical language and assumptions of their time. The record does not fully capture how risk was weighed against observed compliance, or how much uncertainty surrounded the release decision. In places, the file is simply silent. These gaps existed within broader investigative constraints. In the early 1970s, there were no DNA databases to link cases across jurisdictions. Behavioral profiling units had not yet been formalized. Crimes were connected primarily through physical evidence and eyewitness accounts, when victims were young women without immediate links to one another. Similarities were easy to overlook. Cultural assumptions compounded these limits. Appearance carried weight. A person who spoke calmly, showed interest in law enforcement, and moved comfortably within institutional spaces did not align with prevailing images of violent offenders. Gendered expectations also played a role. Threat was often imagined as impulsive, visibly aggressive, and overtly antisocial. Violence that unfolded through conversation and apparent consent was harder to recognize in real time. Institutional silence did not arise from neglect alone. Early warnings were minimized because they did not fit established categories. Intelligence was often interpreted as insight or self-awareness, and in some cases as evidence of rehabilitation. Compliance was taken at face value. The ability to articulate emotions was mistaken for the ability to regulate them. When Ed Kemper spent time with police officers socially, that proximity may have reduced suspicion rather than increased scrutiny. Familiarity created reassurance, not concern. Silence also has psychological consequences. For families of victims, gaps in the record can become lasting sources of distress. Unanswered questions persist long after legal resolution. For communities, the absence of clear warning signs can produce a false sense of safety, followed by a sudden rupture when patterns finally emerge. The realization that danger developed quietly, without obvious markers, can be deeply destabilizing. For offenders, silence can function as permission. When behaviors pass without challenge, they may be experienced as invisible or tacitly tolerated. The lack of response does not cause violence, but it can shape how boundaries are perceived. In this sense, silence becomes part of the environment in which decisions are made. This case illustrates how violence does not require perfect concealment to persist. It requires enough ambiguity to delay recognition. Many cases drift toward becoming cold, not because evidence vanishes, but because attention does fragmented by assumptions, limited tools, and the ordinary tendency to interpret quiet as safety. The final acts in this case did not follow the same pattern as those that came before. When Ed Kemper killed his mother, and later her close friend, the violence moved inward, toward the domestic space that had framed his psychological life for years. The methods differed, and the setting was no longer remote or transitional. This was not a site chosen for concealment. It was a site of confrontation. What stands out is what followed. There was no attempt to flee, no effort to construct an alibi. After the killings, Kemper left the scene, drove for several days, and then called law enforcement from a public phone. He identified himself. He described what he had done. The surrender was voluntary and direct. In later statements, he spoke of emotional depletion rather than fear. He described a sense of exhaustion, as if the internal force driving his behavior had run its course. There was no indication of panic. The affect reported by those who interacted with him was flat, measured, and controlled. These observations do not explain the violence, but they help frame its endpoint. The behavior suggests closure for the offender, even as it created permanent absence for others. The legal process that followed was shaped by the historical moment. California had suspended the death penalty the year before. As a result, execution was not an option, regardless of the severity of the crimes. Kemper was tried, convicted, and sentenced to multiple consecutive life terms. The sentence ensured permanent incarceration, but it did not offer narrative resolution in the way capital cases sometimes attempt to do. Since his imprisonment, Kemper has remained confined. He has declined opportunities for parole hearings, stating that he considers himself a continued risk. Over time, he became a source of information for investigators and researchers seeking to understand serial violence. Interviews conducted in controlled settings contributed to the development of behavioral analysis frameworks, particularly around offender cognition and self-awareness. These contributions, however, have limits. Retrospective insight is shaped by memory, motivation, and context. What offenders say after the fact may illuminate patterns, but it does not reconstruct internal experience with certainty. Technology and structured interviews can organize data, but they cannot fully recover subjective meaning or emotional truth. As analysts, we are left with layers of knowledge that do not align neatly. We know, with certainty, what actions occurred, when they occurred, and how the legal system responded. We can identify patterns of behavior, escalation, and fixation. We can situate those patterns within social and institutional contexts. Beyond that, interpretation begins. There are elements that remain unresolved. We do not know how alternative interventions might have altered the trajectory. We do not know which signals mattered most, or which moments represented points of no return. We do not know how much confirms theory and how much reflects individual contingency. This is where the case ultimately rests, not in mystery, but in ambiguity. Law assigns responsibility. Science seeks explanation. Neither restores what was lost. The enduring value of this analysis lies elsewhere in recognizing how violence can develop quietly, how systems can miss what does not conform, and how understanding patterns may help us respond earlier, even when certainty remains out of reach.